What's your sense of whether negotiations in recent days will reach any conclusion?
Well, I think it looks to me as if there is going to be an intensified period of negotiations, which will maybe in the next fortnight produce some results, or maybe it'll go on for longer. Maybe we'll be talking more about May. But it does look as if, this next 2 months, one way or another, could bring the war, could bring a ceasefire and serious negotiations. My own view about Putin's military action against Ukraine was that it was wrong. I mean, you just can't justify treating a country like that, invading it, the deaths, the carnage, the deep remorse and unhappiness. That is wrong, And I am very strongly of the view that China's position on the importance, the principle of sovereignty and non-intervention is a building block for not just Chinese foreign policy, but is a building block, because it's in the UN Charter, for global harmony, global peace, global stability.
Now, since we are based in Beijing, we have seen quite a number of calls coming from all over the world for China to play a so-called pivotal role as a mediator, particularly from Washington. So how do you see the nature of these calls?
Well, I think it's extremely interesting because who could have imagined 10 years ago China being asked to play this kind of role in this kind of situation? I mean, it is inconceivable. And it is a testament to the extent to which China's importance and profile in the world has grown over this period. So now you have a situation which is absolutely of China's, not of China's making, which is fundamentally a traditional problem in Western terms, which is the relationship between the West and Russia, which is hardly new. It goes back a long time. And China is now being seen as the way in which maybe the two parties can be brought together and to reach some kind of agreement. Yeah, I think this is very interesting. And the fact is, of course, that the reason why China can play this role is, one, because it is so important, and secondly, because it has good relations with both Russia and the Ukraine. A mediator has to be able to speak to both parties.
You heard from the Chinese ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Qin Gang, written in an article to the Washington Post suggesting China did not know beforehand of this military action against Ukraine. And that is certainly a rebuttal of the fake accusations against China over the past few weeks by the so-called unidentified sources reported by some Western media. How do you see these kinds of fake accusations against China mounting on one issue after another, related to the Russian-Ukraine crisis, the nature of this?
Well, by the way, I think Qin Gang's statement is very important and very timely in relationship to this. I think that, during wars, there's always a great deal of this kind of thing going on, disinformation and so on. And perhaps now with the growth of communications, websites, we're all party to that now. So we all and we're all reading this kind of material. And so, the idea that the United States seems to be the key source of this kind of stuff, this kind of fake news. So it's designed to, I think, confuse, send people off on at tangents and so on. The aim was to associate China with what Russia was doing in a very close way. I mean, if you knew about it, why didn't you do anything about it, sort of thing? And that was why I think it was a very deliberate and knowing act to spread that kind of rumor at that point, because it would damage China. The aim was to damage China. So it's not important to reply to them all, but it's important to reply to the key ones.
Having said that, though, Martin, let's just move on to another very important component of the whole thing. That is, what has been this relationship between the West and Russia?
The problems in the relationship have been going on for a very long time. I mean, basically, since the 1917 revolution, if one takes the whole historical sweep of it. But the key moment is obviously the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the American response to this. And I think looking back on it now, it's clear that America made two absolutely cardinal errors after 1991.
What do you mean?
Well, the first of all, America believed that it was now the sole superpower. This was the unipolar moment. It was capable of doing anything. And hence the Iraq War, the occupation of Afghanistan, and so on. And we all know that that was a huge mistake. So American hubris after 1991 led to two fundamental errors. That was one. And the second one was how it treated Russia. Because it basically treated Russia as a defeated nation. I mean, it could have had a different kind of relationship with Russia, but it opted not to do that.
What do you mean?
So,
like maybe that the U.S. had with the European countries after World War II, that the U.S. could treat Russia then that way?
Well, it could. I mean, so Europe is also obviously very important in relationship to this, but to try and find ways of establishing ties and contacts and trade and an atmosphere around the relationship, which was positive. And to do that, they would, the West needed to take into account Russian interests and Russian security. And basically, they didn't do that. They treated it as a defeated nation. And the result is what's happened now, which is suddenly, you know, Russia's done something which in effect tears up the relationship since 1991.
It is very much debated. It was very much debated also in the West, if I remember right, Mr. Jacques, about you know, the relationship with Russia. At that time, there were different groups arguing for different things. For example, Henry Kissinger and some of the others of the, you know, the earlier generation strategists talking about should treat Russia more with respect, otherwise there could be consequences. And at that time, we remember the Clinton administration did try to guarantee those earlier generation strategies, saying, well, maybe you don't have to worry about that, but things are going very differently now if you look back in retrospect.
Yeah, I mean, we can see now that what happened was that Russia was still basically regarded as the other and as an antagonist and something that a country that needed, you couldn't trust and needed to be kept at arm's bay. And I would emphasize that, in fact, the kind of coverage you get in Europe of Russia is has been much more hostile than that towards China. So there's a sort of, you know, a Russophobic attitude that's been very, very true for quite a long time now. Well, actually, it's never really gone away, except for that brief period of Gorbachev and the early period after 1991.
But you think about that, people would argue, see what Russia did. They had this huge military action against Ukraine. That's what Russia is, and therefore the way we treated Russia was correct. Some in the West would strongly argue that. And now this is a quote unquote, as some see, an opportunity to go against Russia 100% and squeeze their international space off totally. Now, how do you see those arguments?
Well, you're correct. That people say, well, look, this is what Russia's like. It's always been like this. You can never trust it. So, you know, let's increase our military expenditure. Let's all band together. Let's extend NATO, and let's keep the Russians down. I mean, that has been, I think, the predominant theme, the predominant strand since 1991. But there was, as you correctly say, an early phase which was more open-minded. But that didn't last so long.
But how do you see so-called ideas of Europe in this regard vis-a-vis that of Washington. Do you see much difference? Do you see much independent thinking from Brussels or other capitals?
Less than there was. I think that this moment marks a closing of the ranks between the US and Europe. Ever since the end of the Cold War, there's been a slow, uneven process towards growing distance between the United States and Europe. And the best example of this has been Germany, which has had a very, very independent-minded attitude both towards Russia and also towards China. And we can see now that the effect of what Putin did in his military action against Ukraine has been to basically reunify the West and end that tendency. Will that continue? Well, you know, it's got a momentum now. It's not going to suddenly be reversed. I mean, if there was a ceasefire, if there was a settlement, an agreed settlement, which was mutually satisfactory and so on, that would help to halt this process. But, you know, I think it's going to be very difficult to stop that now.
On the security issue of Europe, earlier there was already debates about whether NATO is still that necessary, as you can see the arguments of Germany and others. And now, of course, NATO seemed to be apparently strengthened. But there is a very interesting discussion about exactly what the role of NATO is. For example, whether it will continue to be eastward expansion. For example, the issue of Ukraine, whether Ukraine will be accepted, it's already said not. So how will this issue continue to haunt NATO and the European countries? And how will they figure out the right proportion of roles for the United States and the European capitals? These are all, and of course Brussels, these are all very interesting moving factors.
Yeah, well, I think that the question of the future of NATO was actually quite widely discussed after 1991, because people said, well, what's the point of NATO now? I mean, the whole point of NATO was the Cold War, the axis against the Soviet Union, and so on. So now that, you know, now that with the disintegration of the Soviet Union, what's the point of NATO? And so it went through a period where it was sort of, you know, became a bit of an afterthought, actually, in Western discussions and the Western agenda. And suddenly, with this development, then NATO is, you know, back with some force. And I guess that's, you know, that's going to be true for a while.
Right.
I mean, I would add one thing, though, and that is that, I mean, Zelensky has said, as of the last 24 hours, that that it would be wrong for Ukraine to join NATO, and that would be part of his you know, that would be one of the compromises that he would make. So that rolls back that issue a bit.
Martin Jacques, always a pleasure, sir. Thank you so much.